right, if we're all set and we've got the mics up and running, we are going to first give you a couple-minute video clip to give you a little context of what we're talking about. So whenever we've got the next couple people sitting down and you want to kill the lights and run the clip, that'd be great.
Chinese audiences love big movies with special effects, so Hollywood films account for half of the receipts from Chinese theaters.
It was all under control.
Yeah, that's what it looked like.
Last week, a team of highly coordinated drivers took down an entire military convoy. I need your help, Dom. I need your team.
A sharp rise in China's box office revenues has Hollywood hunting for local partners to help them crack the booming Asian market.
Simon, after all these years, I was willing to let bygones be bygones.
What does that mean?
I do not know.
Just tell me what happened.
It's 25 years ago.
I have no idea who you really are.
Expect more foreign filmmakers to pursue co-productions with Chinese film outfits to gain maximum exposure in a promising but tricky market.
我读了你们小蛮牛植入的剧本，我非常非常的满意。如果你们能够将我们故事的背景转换成大草原，有一股特别特别清新的味道，然后咱们就可以签约了。
All right, ladies and gentlemen, thank you for being here. We have a thoroughly knowledge and distinguished panel here. Don't let their titles fool you. They actually know what they're talking about. The discussion today, the topic is, can Hollywood speak Chinese? What that really means, more than anything else, is that in the old days, when Hollywood was first setting up and dealing with different international markets, what it was particularly trying to do was looking for something exotic, something different. We used to hear stories about Hollywood venturing off, as in Cecil B. DeMille, and doing a movie. It did it for the U.S. market. International sales were a bonus. International partnerships were wonderful. Nowadays, the world has changed. The world's economy has changed, and the money has changed. China is, in many ways, not only the future, it's also the present. And what we have discussed today with our distinguished group of panelists is the fact that not only is China now one of the largest markets globally for U.S. products and film, it is also the fact that it is one of the greatest sources of capital and one of the greatest opportunities for financing U.S. films, not just to go into China, but internationally. We've seen a number of tremendous deals that our panelists can talk about in terms of financing, in terms of content, even for you going to the movie theaters. For those of you who ever go to an AMC theater, guess what? It's actually Chinese-owned now. So what we are going to talk about today are the different angles and the different aspects of what's involved. And in order to do that, I'm going to go through my group of panelists, going from my right, your left. We have Stuart Ford. Stuart is our world citizen, meaning that he's the actual non-American here, as opposed to the people who've all spent lots of time out in China. As Stuart has actually was originally a British entertainment lawyer. He did the he earned his Indie stripes with Miramax, and he actually, when in launching I Am Global, he has the advantage of not only having offices throughout the world, but actually having Indian bosses. So he can talk about content and perspective not just in the Chinese style and the American style, but in the Indian style as well. So we're looking forward to having you and picking your brain, Stuart. Next to me is Brian Goldsmith, who is the co-chief operating officer of the profligate Lionsgate. He was, among other things, instrumental in their 2012 acquisition of Summit Entertainment. But the real reason we want him here today is because of the fact that he's developed content partnerships with Alibaba Group. For those of you who are not aware, Alibaba is not just China's Amazon, it's their eBay, their PayPal, and 20,000 other things, and also one of the great digital distributors. And Has also developed a world streaming platform and has developed slate financing co-production agreements with Hunan TV, among others. So, Brian, we're very glad to have you. Ryan Kavanaugh, who is a man who has essentially been living the Chinese dream, so to speak, for 7 years.
Like that, 9.
9 years. So you can think about it, 9 lives, 9 years. He's the founder and CEO of Relativity, and they have been on the ground in China for years. They've also done a tremendous number of different elements, not just in terms of movies and TV, including sports management, where you're cracking the Chinese market. And they have taken the lead not only in getting content into China, but in working deals to take Chinese content out of China and internationally. Bob Simons is a chairman and CEO of STX Entertainment. Not only is he a highly successful producer, who's done over 30 different studio titles, he's also managed to determine in launching STX exactly where the market is in terms of mid-budget productions. In theory. No. You figured it out. Execution's coming next, but you figured it out, and we're going. But he's also managed to, in working this, determine how to take U.S. content and Chinese money and turn it into a, in theory, highly successful global venture. And so we are going to talk to Bob about that as well. So the main thing what I'd like to do is that we're going to go back and forth between our panelists. I have questions for each of them, but honestly, if they decided to start ignoring me and Ryan pulls out his rubber balls and chucks them at people, well, no, we have a good panel. So that being said, one of the first things to understand about China is the fact that there is a very clear cultural issue in doing business with the Chinese and negotiating with them. Bob, you got to experience that firsthand. What are the first observations you have about those cultural differences?
Actually, a great question. And it's funny because I see Dominic Eng over there, who runs East West Bank, who was actually instrumental in putting our deal together, but is living at that sort of inflection point. And I see Michael Eisner out there, who also had done a bunch of business over there. One of the things that I find really interesting, other than having really good partners who could help sort of figure out culturally what those differences might be, was I was talking to a friend who runs a studio, and he was really frustrated with so many meetings that he would be having with these Chinese. The Chinese would come to town and they'd want to have a meeting. And after the third or fourth time in that cycle, he was frustrated, they were frustrated, and what I tried to explain, and I'd love to see if this has been sort of your guys' experience also, is that in America we show up and we want to make a deal, and then you get to know them afterwards. And in China, it's the opposite, which is you need to spend a lot of time breathing the same air, acting as a resource, hooking people up with things that are not actually in your self-interest, doing whatever is necessary to help them out, whether it's connections or insight or anything like that. And the crazy thing is that the things got dicey because the Americans were saying, well, look, you know what? I don't want to have these meetings. They're a waste of time. They're not serious. Whereas the Chinese were saying the exact opposite, which is they'd show up and they'd say, "You're not serious. You're asking me to be in business with you, and you don't even know who I am." And that was sort of an interesting sort of disconnect. But what I've found over the last couple of years, because while TPG is our biggest backer, Honey Capital, who's one of China's biggest private equity firms, is, I think, our third biggest shareholder. And then the Hawaii deal, which is more of a slate deal, just came in. Both of them were very Western in their approach. So it made for a very sort of easy transaction. They both came about really quickly once we settled on the two of them. Is that kind of an answer?
Yeah, that's an answer, and we can all certainly build on it, because the fact is that, as you mentioned, there are a few different companies that are particular that you've been involved in. Now, Ryan, Relativity has been involved with a number of different kinds of companies in that regard. So what kind of differences have you seen before we go into explain what these companies are?
Well, I would actually mirror pretty much what Bob said. And I feel I'm jealous because the two companies he dealt with, both Honey and East West, are people that understand American business. So I know the Honey guys and the YE brothers I know well. So I'm really jealous. You probably didn't have to sit through the 2 months of dinner every night. I feel like I got the girl on the rebound. And eat whatever it is that you have no idea you're eating. So for me, it was interesting because our first movie in China was 2005. We did one of the first co-productions called Forbidden Kingdom, and it was Jackie Chan and Jet Li's first movie, and it was a full co-pro. So we had to go deal with propaganda and SARFT and all the things that nobody had even heard of, because when you looked at the value of China on the food chain of the movie studios, it was like 10 grand, 5 grand, 2 grand, and this was something that was going to be, I think it was at the time the largest movie shot in China, $55 million, and it was actually even originally called The Monkey King, and propaganda made us change the name because it didn't stick to the legend. So I thought I was brilliant when I sold the Chinese rights to the YE brothers for $6 million, until they went and did, like, inflation adjusted, probably about $45 million in the box, which means they took home about 20. And that's when I said, okay, there was only 2,000 movie theaters at the time, too. There's a really big market here, and we shouldn't be selling movies. We should actually be trying to figure out how to get into this market. And the one thing that I learned, having spent probably the better part of 8 months getting co-production set up, scouting, meeting with SARFT and meeting with propaganda, was exactly what Bob said, is that they do business the exact opposite of the way we do business. We want to say, okay, we've got from 4 to 5, let's get in a room and see if we can close a deal. They basically say, you're going to come to our offices, we're going to spend the whole day together, we're going to talk a lot, and a lot of it's going to not have anything to do with our deal. Then we're going to go have a couple-hour lunch, and we're going to drink wine. And by the way, just for any of you out there that don't know this, bring lots of people with you when you go to China, because the tradition there is you don't actually cheers, like pour a glass of wine and drink like a sip, but so each person has to stand up and do a toast, and they give you like a shot, which is maybe like about equivalent to 2 shot size of wine, and you have to do one with each person. And that's not just once, they keep doing it through lunch. So when you go like I did with, there's 2 people in this room who've come, one particularly who's come a lot with me, with 2 of us and there's 16 of them, by the end of lunch you're tripping out of the room. But they want to know who you are, and they want to get to know you, and there's a very it's a system, it's an order, and I'd say the big difference is, America's a new country, so we don't really have these traditions. We don't have kind of these established, almost like rules of business, and I don't know what other way to say it, but if you're not willing to go put the face-to-face time in and sit down with them, literally, once, I went once a month for 8 years, and sit down, and maybe it wasn't even until the 5th or 6th trip till you start talking about, okay, how do we start making a deal, and have the dinners and do things like, hey, my son's coming to town. Can you help tour him around, because he doesn't have anybody to tour him around. Whereas in America, like Bob said, we just hop in the room and say, let's make a deal. And sorry to go on for so long, but I'm just going to finish off with, so I spent from about 2004 till 2008, let's say, going once a month, and we never opened up a relativity building, because the one thing is that the Chinese way is about the Chinese way, and they're very proud of their culture, as they should be, and they're very proud of displaying that culture. And one thing that you never want to do in China is do anything that's going to say, hey, we're trying to like impact that or change that or take it over. And so, I didn't bring relativity cards. We didn't open a relativity office. I functioned through people that I met and people that I trusted. And then right around 2008, as all of a sudden people were talking about, oh, there's all this money in China and box office is growing. All of a sudden I saw, no offense to people might be in the room, but a Fox building pop up and a Universal building pop up and a Disney building pop up, and I was just like, oh, those are going to be torn down in like 4 months, no question about it. And they're out in the press talking, oh, China's going to triple our box office, and that doesn't sit very well with whether it's SARFT or people above SARFT, and they all literally disappeared because They just, first of all, unless Rupert Murdoch or Justin Murdoch's going to China every month, they're not going to build those relationships. And they also don't want to sit with a guy who can't make a decision. So they don't want to sit with you for 6 months and then say, okay, let's talk about a deal now. And then you're like, oh, I have to go back to my board.
Right.
You need to have the authority. All right, Stuart, you're all set. Do you have you've been doing it from a slightly different angle, and what's your perspective in terms of how you've been dealing with different kinds of companies in China?
Well, when we started to take a real interest in China, I had some advantage because my other shareholder, Reliance, which is a big Indian conglomerate, had been doing literally billions of dollars of business across other sectors there for a number of years and had a fairly substantial on-the-ground presence who helped me navigate the waters. And their first advice to me was not dissimilar to what Bob said, which is don't show up and expect immediate results. Their other advice to me was make yourself relevant if you want to get anywhere. So rather than just going to shake the tree, like a lot of US companies and international companies, we decided to figure out what we could offer to the local industry as a way to then, as something of a Trojan horse as to get into broader discussions. So, my company's core competency is international licensing and distribution. So we decided to make our pitch to the local industry to handle the international sales of their bigger ticket Chinese films, which is not a hugely significant market internationally, certainly compared to our Hollywood output, and it's not an area where we had any competition from Hollywood companies. And that's a strategy that served us quite well because it's put us in business with all of the biggest players in the Chinese industry: Huayi, China Film Group, Enlight, Wanda, and so forth. And that's allowed us as a company to get an awful lot of airtime with these companies, and me as a CEO to get lots of face time with the decision makers. And hopefully, over a period of years, that's going to yield results for us on a strategic level. But it's all with this ongoing sort of mentality that we're in it for the long haul, guys. We're not just coming to try and rip as much money out of the local marketplace as we can, as quickly as we can. And I hope that differentiates us a little bit.
Absolutely. Now, Brian, with Lionsgate, you've had multiple different approaches in terms of not only the type of platforms you're going into, but the type of companies you've dealt with. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Sure. Our approach to China has similar elements that the other speakers here have touched on. For us, we had a product pipeline to initially rely on that was fairly robust. So we had just a very large licensing opportunity. And the way we enter into any market that we're new to is we choose partners. So we don't think we have the smartest idea. We don't think we're the smartest guys, but we do know how to work well with people, and we know how to work well with partners. And we've got long-term partnerships with Televisa and Studio Canal and CBS, and so we just know how to sort of walk in someone else's shoes and try not to take every crumb off the table. That's sort of a basic philosophy the company has. And so in looking at China, our approach was identify the best companies. And by best, we mean the ones who are the most innovative in terms of their thinking, the ones who were open to working with a Hollywood company, and who had market share. And we put 3 people in Hong Kong to license our product, both library and new release, television and film, throughout North and South Asia. And as part of that remit, we asked that our leading licensing person spent a lot of her time in China. And to sort of the collective points here, part of that, to me, it's not just about how much time, how many meetings you need to break through in order to get to that really meaningful meeting. We're just really far away, and it's not like I'm having a conversation with, if I pick up the phone and call Ryan, we know what we're talking about, and we know the terms of art, and we know all of that really well, so we can get to a deal or choose not to do a deal very quickly. Whereas there's not just a cultural language and distance/time gap. There's just a term of art gap, right, that you have to bridge, and that just requires time and patience. And I think that separates. The reason why the folks on this stage have had results is because they put that time in and they don't get discouraged by multiple meetings. Anyway, back to your question. So we started by licensing to some of the leading leading companies, and then we thought about, okay, what are our larger ambitions in terms of working with partners, and so that led us to partnerships with Alibaba, who has just a tremendous market share and connection to the consumer throughout Greater China, as well as beyond Greater China's borders, and Hunan TV, which is a leading broadcaster who appeals to a younger.
Second largest in China.
What's unique about them is not just their market share. They also appeal to a younger demographic, which if you look at it maps well onto the movies that we make. So we make films focused on young adult genres, and they skew younger in terms of their demographic. So they were an interesting partner for us because they had a massive, they're a massive broadcaster. They have television production. They have a small but growing film company, and they have outdoor advertising. They own cable networks. They just are in a lot of different fields, some of which we're in, some of which we're not in, but all of which we have some complementary core sort of skills, but also where they can help us and where we can help them. So, for example, you take a look at the film division. Our team is now spending lots of time with their team, sort of getting them smart on how we make movies here, and that will have enormous value for them as they grow their production business.
Now, here's a question that comes off of that, is that once they know more and they have a comfort zone, is there any risk of meddling? Where you have somebody who they feel like they can start dictating content, or they can start dictating any kind of terms in that regard?
Well, generally we don't get into partnerships that would involve dictating the type of content we make. But I wouldn't single out China in that regard, right? So, like, there are plenty of territories that have censorship or different regulations or rules around the type of content that they allow to be imported into their country. But beyond that, there just may not be a cultural resonance. There's currently a lot of Hollywood movies don't work in certain territories because they're very focused on their local content. And so I'm not going to change anybody's mind. But what I do want to do is pay attention to, like, we make movies for the global marketplace, right? We make movies for the world. So if we're doing our job right, we're successful in the U.S., but we're successful internationally as well. And so if I'm not listening to my distributor in Brazil and my distributor in Germany and France and Australia, and not thinking about what type of product they need for their markets, then I can't be successful in that endeavor.
One of the things you just mentioned just off of that is that, yes, China is not unique in terms of censorship. It's not unique in terms of its views. But there is a system in place that limits the number of films that go into mainland China. And I think right now the number, if I'm correct, is 34 per year.
36 now.
Is it 36? Oh, it's going up again. So it's been gradually creeping up. If I recall, the first film that really made a big splash in China that was imported in by the China Film Group was Superman, back in the mid-1980s. And the one thing I remember about that movie was that it was it was far more successful than anybody at all had planned, but that there was one line in that movie that really offended the Chinese government, which was Superman saying that he fights for truth, justice, in the American way. And so it was a point where, if I recall correctly, rather than just simply cutting the line or figuring out a way to fix it, somebody got it in their heads to pull the movie entirely from the theaters, because they felt like it was in some ways denigrating Chinese culture, or at least promoting American culture. We've come a long way since then. And so one thing I want to ask based off that is, okay, if it's 36 movies, Brian, are you willing to talk a little bit about how that system works and how you sell something in China?
I mean, first of all, you said something that I hate to say, but I would disagree with a little bit, where you said China's not unique in the way that it censors movies. So China is unique in the way that it censors movies.
That's fine.
And not in a bad way. They just have a different set of eyes with which they look at any movie. So no matter what license you have, no matter what status you're at, you could be the biggest production company, you could be Chinese local language. You have to go through a group, whether you want to call it censorship or propaganda, and they look at your piece of material, and the group that runs the whole thing is called SARF, which is the State Administration of Radio, Film, and Television. So anything that goes on anything, they're looking at, and they're looking at for three reasons. One is, China's a very proud culture. So anything that in any way they feel will impact the power of that culture, and they can't be. I'm not going to agree or disagree, except to say, we're a much younger country. they've gone through a lot of history. So anything that in any way kind of affects that history or says they're less powerful, they don't want in the movie. Now, they're not going to pull a movie entirely if there's one line anymore. They're gonna censor that line. But there's a lot more than that. There's things like there's themes that they don't like. And this isn't for everything, but generally they don't like things that have ghosts in them. They don't like things that have too much blood. And ironically, we got Immortals released in China, which I don't know how we did because it had ghosts and blood. But they do censor it, and they do sit there and spend the time saying we're going to cut this and cut that and cut this. So I think that you've got so one thing to clarify is you've got call it anywhere between around 66 to 68 slots between flat fee and revenue sharing that everybody in Hollywood's competing to get. But you also have Chinese co-productions, and I think that's set up for a specific reason. And I don't think I think it's overlooked. Meaning, clearly, what the Chinese are saying are, okay, you can only have 20% of our box office. They have 300 films they release on their own, 60 American films. So we'll let America put 20% of our films out. If you want to go outside of that system, come work here. And a Chinese co-production doesn't fall into either of those slots. So it means that you have to have certain things, certain Chinese, crew members and cast members and, elements. It doesn't mean that it can't be English. Forbidden Kingdom was 100% English for those of you that saw it. I think what it does is it's trying to encourage people to say, don't look at China as a place just to make money on your movies. And don't look at China as a place just to extract dollars to invest in movies. But look at it as a place that we're trying to build an industry that works here too. And we're more than willing to let you own more of our box office. But you got to do it here because you can't just take it from there, stick it here, grab our money and leave. And so, sure, there's lots of sensitivity in censorship. And, it's also a growing market. I mean, if you think about it, they went from 2,000 theaters in 2005 to 20,000 theaters today. So that's 10 times growth in, 10 years. And so they're learning. I mean, I can't tell you how many times Mr. Gu, that's the guy who used to be the chairman of, until last year, Washa, and I would argue over love stories. I'd be like, no, love stories are going to work. Let's try it. No, they've never worked before. And I'm like, but that's the point. Like, no one's tried it. And so I think there's a learning curve, but there's also a misunderstanding that, China isn't trying to block American movies and just say you can only have 60. They're trying to say, if you want more, come here, work with us.
Of course, one could argue that that's an attitude that's not that different than the way they have been with cars or various other industries, is that trying to get people to invest in China and build for the Chinese market.
Well, there's a lot of investment. If you I look at China very differently. I don't look at China as one country, and that's something that as our company in China, we have our head offices are in Beijing. It's not Relativity; it's called Skyland, which is a wholly owned subsidiary of Relativity, and it's a Chinese company. And it really breaks China into different countries, so to speak. And I think one of the things that will occur over the next 5 years is that someone might realize, well, a movie that might work in Hunan is not the same movie that might work in Beijing or in Linyi. And right now, the system just says, okay, you put the same movie out for 2 weeks in every theater, and then you pull it. And that hasn't yet changed, but eventually it will. And I think eventually people will understand that there's a reason why there's so many different dialects of Chinese. There really are different mentalities. I don't want to say it's not a different country, but they're just such different mentalities that, there's also the opportunity when they get to 100,000 theaters to say, well, you're only going to open an average movie on 20,000 screens because, it's only going to work in certain areas if it's a certain type of movie. And that's, I think, what they've done in other industries as well.
Yeah. One thing, just to bring up off of that, and then I'll switch subjects a little bit to the capital flows. Hong Kong traditionally was the great outlet of Chinese culture. Admittedly, this is Cantonese, not Mandarin, but it was the great center for production. But a lot of that's really shifted to Beijing, and a lot of those, there's been a lot of movement of talent. There's been a lot of effort to consolidate and encourage productions up north. how much of an influence does Hong Kong still have, and what's going on in Beijing that makes it so different or so attractive? Stuart?
Well, what's going on in Beijing is there's a lot more money to make movies.
Smaller.
And there's a huge, huge local audience to watch them. So what's happened in the last 10 to 15 years is a lot of filmmaking talent has moved from Hong Kong to Beijing and are making movies there, whereas the Hong Kong movie-making culture was really made for a Hong Kong audience and to some extent an Asian audience and to some extent a global audience. The trend, understandably, in recent years has been to make movies for the Chinese audience, the mainland China audience, and then to worry about the rest. So there's been this evolution of talent. There's been a shift in where the audience focus is. Eventually, what will happen is as the budgets and the ambition level of the Chinese films increases, the need will arise for these films to work on a more global level as well, just because it'll be essential to monetize these films outside of Greater China. And at that point, I would expect gradually the audience focus will shift again to a more international audience. But right now, it's a little bit China focused, and in that respect, it's different to the way the Hong Kong industry used to work. There still is a Hong Kong film industry, still churning out a lot of martial arts films and cop dramas, but it's suffered as a result of the huge exponential growth further north. And it's a bit of a shame for those of us who grew up watching Hong Kong martial arts films and action movies, but to some extent, what that output from Hong Kong has been absorbed within the broader Chinese film industry.
If I can just add, that was a great answer. I can just add one thing, which is, don't forget, Beijing is the political, that is the capital, that's where all the political power is, and there is a very important thrust on what they're calling soft power, exporting culture, and that's sort of a consolidation across lots of different industries. I mean, one of the ironies is that, my family business is in water, and one of the offshoots was I was lead director of China Water for a long time, and it's 11 bottled water factories in mainland China. And we actually were told very politely but firmly we had to move our headquarters from Hong Kong to Shanghai for that very reason. That they needed to consolidate everything on the mainland as opposed to Hong Kong.
I'm going to mirror, exactly that as well. So what I see is, Hong Kong is Hong Kong's a dream. When I say a dream, I mean, it is a melting pot. It's got some of the best 5-star restaurants in the world. You can go there and feel like you're in London. It's, to me, Hong Kong isn't China, even though it's part of China. You don't need a visa to go. You don't need, you can, there's a lot of bankers there. There's, a lot of Caucasians there. There's people from all over the world. And I think the Chinese somewhat see Hong Kong as, they own it, but it's not really China. And I think as the film industry grew up, which is only in the last 5 years, they realized that film is such a key component of exporting the Chinese culture that they want to keep it within their reach, and that's Beijing and Shanghai, and there is a very big booming business in Shanghai, so let's not forget about that, and in other places in Hunan and kind of throughout some of the main provinces, but certainly the central government and the central business runs, and government and business are tied, runs out of Beijing. It's that simple.
I just imagine the idea, to contrast for everybody here, as if Washington, D.C. suddenly became the center of filmmaking.
Yeah, except that the difference is that Washington, D.C. has no say in our films. So you can't get a film passed in China without having censorship or propaganda, which is run by SARF, which is run by the government, to say yes.
True. The last time we flirted with that was World War II. We haven't been there since then. So.
That's true.
For anybody who can remember all the times when all the Hollywood executives had positions as colonels or generals in the military, so that they could keep on making productions, but with the government looking over them.
Is that true?
Yeah, it's significant. Like Jack Warner, for
that.
example, got a general posting. There are a number of them.
We gotta go get one of those.
Yeah.
I had no idea. I gotta get me a general.
I want to be a general.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, things are a little bit different, but if you remember, is that all the different studios, there is that whole sense of it, but we didn't have that drive to keep it that way. You can't imagine that the innovation would have happened here in the U.S.
Well, we have freedom of speech.
Well, we do have freedom of speech, but it's that entrepreneurship as well. I think that's one of the things that's changing in China is that some of the great companies for distribution, some of the great companies that are there, not the Washas and such, but rather the Tencents, the Alibabas. A lot of that comes from a more innovative style. It's still not ours, don't get me wrong, but how much of that innovation in terms of the digital distribution and such, how much is that playing into things?
I'll just say, to me, China is the most capitalist place I've ever seen. So it's as capitalist, if not more capitalist, than the U.S. It just doesn't happen to be, a quote freedom of speech. It's a communist society, and you got to live by their rules. Just like if someone came to the U.S. and said, I want the U.S. to run the government, communist. It's not fair that, I had the #1 water and some other guy just came in and beat me. The government stop it. Like, you'd be like, what are you talking about? So, in China, that's the way it is. That's the way it's always been. But it is, and from everything I've seen since I've gone there, it is the single most capitalist place there is. I mean, there is more venture capital, more investment, more real estate growth, more, you name the industry, and there are people there that are just clamoring to grow it, and the government doesn't stop it. The government wants to see growth. The government wants to see, capitalism occur, but they just divide capitalism and freedom of speech, or capitalism and communism. They're kind of, they're not tied, and so I don't think it's actually that it's growing as much as it is. You had now finally China had a huge lower class, and then like this small upper class, and now they have a very fast growing middle class that can help afford to drive growth in all these segments.
So
Maseratis.
Brian, since you've been dealing with a lot of these innovators as well, what kind of experiences have you had in that regard?
With the digital players specifically?
With the digital players specifically, but even this broader entrepreneurial aspect.
So all the companies we choose to work with are sort of innovative entrepreneurial companies, or the individuals within those companies are very innovative and entrepreneurial. So, Alibaba is obviously is one of the best known global brands, I would assume at this point, right? It's a massive company.
Well, certainly based on the amount of money their stock offering went for.
Well, it was highly publicized, certainly in the financial press. So, what's interesting with Alibaba is we had this. We were talking to them just in generalities in March, April of last year, and just getting to know each other. And we threw out a concept of let's try a streaming type service and see if that works, because that seems like an interesting thing to do. What do you guys think? And they sparked to it, and within 45 days we had executed the deal paperwork. Within 5 months, 6 months of that, we had a service up and running. And so with the right partner, putting the right energy, capital, and time right behind it, you can get quite a bit accomplished. That was a great experience, right? And that was in a space that was really with a company that at that time really had just been dipping its toe into the entertainment space, was really more e-commerce focused. And so we were there at sort of an interesting time for them. Some of the private companies we dealt with, whether it's YE or Enline, YE and Enline are actually publicly traded, but calls more the smaller publicly traded producer distributors. These are run by really entrepreneurial, ambitious, smart executives, and they have a willingness to partner with you if you're bringing something that's of value, right? And then you can, and there's an exchange there, and that for us has been key. We're not interested in doing. Lionsgate has no desires to extract, financing from China just because we want financing. Well, we have plenty of financing already. We're publicly traded. We have access to the
Well, you did just get more from China.
Well, but so
Just kidding.
so
That's a
that
joke,
deal.
I'm sorry.
No, it's also true.
That deal wasn't capital driven. So I've got the company has tons of liquidity. The debt and equity markets are wide open to the company. So why did we do a deal with Hunan? Well, because the strategic benefits of that deal far outweigh the capital. The capital is just a portion of the deal, but now I have the opportunity to invest in their local production. I now have an opportunity to put movies through for that company to distribute movies of ours, where they have a vested interest in the overall success of the movie, not just its success in China. That's a really important difference. And we now have the ability to get more involved on either in formats or actual television production with one of the leading broadcasters, and they have the opportunity to work with us on both the film side, where on projects that they are doing outside of China, as well as inside of China, and with a scripted TV, one of the largest independent scripted TV programming houses here in the U.S. So there's enough mutual give and take where the capital, in some ways, is besides the point. That's a means to align interests, or a portion of your interests, but the strategic elements are actually what matters. And then the other place what's getting super interesting right now in China is in the digital players. So all the digital video players, whether it's Youku or Baidu, they have, and the others, they're now going from purely advertising supported models into some subscription models, and that's a newer model
for them especially.
But they're willing to experiment. I mean, you've got companies that are run by real entrepreneurs who are willing to experiment and try new ways to monetize their product, and that for us is great. We love working with companies like that. So I think there's a lot more commonalities than people than differences,
right,
in some ways.
And Stuart, you've worked in a number of different kinds of deals. You said you've developed one-off relationships as well as longer-term ones. What kind of experiences have you had in that regard?
Mostly very good. We do, as a company, because we're very much an independent company, in terms of our Hollywood output, our English language films, we tend to rely on structured financing on pretty much a picture-by-picture basis. And for better or for worse, what that does, it gives you the chance to play with lots of different partners and be very creative and innovative about deal structures and capital structures. And we have found, as we've made greater and greater inroads into China on a relationship level, it's become quite a ripe breeding ground for potential financing partners on different films. And we have had different Chinese equity partners invest in Hollywood movies that we've made. And maybe we got lucky, maybe we chose the right partners, but it's been a relatively smooth, positive experience where our partners had an appetite for the deal, they understood the risk, they had the capital was available, and the creative rapport has worked relatively smoothly as well. So only good experiences so far. Interestingly, the Chinese film business does not rely heavily on structured financing right now. It's either big studios such as Huayi who are funding these films, or a huge proportion of the output from the Chinese film industry is funded by private individuals, high net worth guys,
or the government.
Or the government, yeah, that's true. But from an entrepreneurial perspective, there's a lot of high net worth individuals who've made money in coal mining or other rather unglamorous areas of industry all over the country, flood to Beijing, inject capital into Chinese films. And so in that respect, there's a certain synchronicity between the way movies are financed there and what we do. And we're trying to capitalize but in a partnerial way.
So, what's actually interesting is Stuart raises a really interesting difference, because on project-by-project films, they do it differently, which is they oftentimes announce the film as a way of essentially starting a syndication process. So they'll commit money, but what they then do is go to a bunch of high net worth individuals or just people, and they cobble together the money that way. Sometimes it comes together, and sometimes it doesn't, which is why a lot of busted deals seem to take place. But that's a very different approach, the sort of syndication that Stuart's talking about.
Well, so then that brings up is that when you were structuring your deals, what did you do differently? What happened differently that you were able to make it work so that you didn't necessarily have them fishing?
Well, from our standpoint, again, when we decided we were going to try to form a new studio, sat down with the guys at TPG and said, look, you can't actually build a studio without China being a big part of the story going forward, a big part of the fabric of who you are as a company. So when we went to Honey, which again is a private equity fund, we knew we were going to a partner who was not necessarily a specific strategic partner, but was somebody who was essentially going to become our tour guide, and that they were going to sort of help us vet who we were going to go to throughout the process. And both in the closing with Honey and also the closing with Huayi, from our standpoint, it was really important that nothing be discussed, nothing be talked about until literally, as Dominic knows, as literally all of the money had literally been in the bank. Not just closed, not negotiated, not closed, but literally fully funded. And that got a little dicey at one point with the guys at Huayi, who've been spectacular partners, but the Chinese SEC, or whatever it's called, required them to post to their shareholders that they were doing a deal, and I didn't want our name mentioned. I didn't want to be in that, potential embarrassment. So it caused a whole bunch of drama by pulling our name and becoming an unnamed American studio, and then eventually we came in. But it was the idea was intentionally to just be, with kind of everything we're trying to do is invisible, and that was just a cultural problem. I mean, we started with making a deal with the 4 major exhibitors, which took so much longer than I could have ever thought, and it took 3 weeks to get the MOUs with the 4 main exhibitors, and about a year to actually get the deals done. And throughout that process, we were terrified that people were going to kind of figure out what we were really trying to do. So keeping everything quiet was sort of like an important part of just kind of everything that we did.
But Bob's also been modest. I mean, so having Honey, he brought 2 of the best partners you could have. So both Honey and YE are non-government affiliated.
Yeah.
Right.
So a lot of the funds. So the one thing that I'm going to say that to add a little bit on what Stuart said and then a little bit onto what Bob said is that probably 70% of the funds in China, the big funds, the ones that are investing in film and investing in growth, are government affiliated in some way. They either directly invested in by the government, or like the government invested in a fund and invested in them, which means they have to run through a government process, which is very extensive and intensive, and it requires steps that are just check the box steps, and it can be things like, well, I need to get a leader to sign off on my visa, and I'm not joking, because if they're government owned, they have to come do an on-site visit check, and it can take them 6 months to get that meeting with that leader to get the on-site visa check. And so by having Honey, he got steered in a very good direction by having Honey, who had announced 2 years prior, we're going to get into the film business. We want to be in the film business. We're not there yet. It was the chairman actually himself who said, I want to allocate resources here. And then YE, who was one of the very first and early on people to recognize the film business in a public company and non-government affiliated, I think you were able to pick 2 of the best partners you could have and navigate where you didn't have to deal with all of the government issues. One of the things that we see a lot is that's uncommon, and that was something that was brilliant on your part. But you deal with 90% of the funds there, and they're like they're Beijing Culture Group, or even some of the broadcasters, even Lionsgate, doing the deal with Hunan TV. I mean, those are government-owned entities, and they have serious regulations. And right now, there's a crackdown going on in China because everybody sees, all this quote corruption, and the crackdown is so severe that literally a Chinese government official can show up at your door in China, knock on your door, and say you're under investigation, and for nothing. And that means you're shut down for 3 months, and they're going to go through every single file to see if you have any kind of affiliation to a paid off government official, and it's not business as usual. And so there's a process where you can have a contract and an agreement, money's in the bank, and still have 22 steps the government has to jump through to actually fund. I mean, so the biggest 6 movies that were funded this year in China were government, in some way or another, government funded.
That's a very significant difference. One thing that actually connects to that, just goes out of that, it's a little more technical in terms of the capital flows. China has a non-convertible currency, or at least a semi-convertible currency.
Oh, it's non-convertible.
Yeah, I mean, well, Hong Kong would argue that it's somewhat convertible, but they have a unique market where they corner that convertibility.
I don't know, Dominique, can you help us convert it?
Yes, he can.
Yeah. No, you can trade it in Toronto apparently as well. So it can be done in a limited fashion. But the reason I bring this up is
Macau
that,
chips.
Yes, absolutely. But we're not doing a gambling panel this year, but it's been done. The reason I bring this up
real
is
business, actually.
is that there's this division. There's this huge amount of capital that China has that's essentially kept outside the country. How much of a difference does that make in terms of how you do business? And when you're dealing with moving money in and out, when you're trying to get financing, there's a lot of that money that needs to be invested outside the country that they don't necessarily bring back in. How much of an impact does that wind up having in terms of the kind of business you do? Or do you see that impact at all, or are you mostly still relying on the internal flows from within China?
In my business, I think we're still relying a lot on internal flows from within China. We're licensing into Chinese companies, or we're exporting their movies. So we're not playing at that altitude right now. Maybe that's not true of my fellow panelists, but I haven't really have much insight on that.
Yeah, it hasn't been a significant issue for us to date, given the types of transactions we're doing. So.
Well, I would be on an island in the middle of, like, I don't know, an island that I own if it wasn't for RMB conversion issues. No, seriously. So we have a deal with the largest company in the world, also the largest bank in the world, called ICBC Bank. And they're a government-owned bank. Goldman Sachs owns 10% of them, but other than that, they are government-run and government-owned. And even they have a very big issue getting significant dollars converted from RMB into dollars. And the primary reason is that the Chinese government wants to control the currency so they can control the economy, which makes sense, right? And one of the things they don't want to see is a huge outflow of capital that isn't intended to come back in and help the Chinese growth, because finally, for the first time, they're like, whoa, look at this. We've got a huge middle class growing. Whoa, we've got, a kind of middle upper class growing. We can actually find ways to really grow and sustain this country, which has 1.5 billion people now. And so they've got to control it to a certain extent. But I can't tell you how many deals I've made or tried to make where it was like, well, we can do it if you can take RMB. And I mean, we had one deal that someone did in RMB, and it was a $7 million deal. It was $56,000 a day until it got to $7 million. There's a group called SAFE, and SAFE is the group that regulates every dollar. So every time you want to move money, you have to go apply to SAFE, and they can say yes or no.
So they did that for each time?
They gave him a $56,000 allocation until he got to his $6.5 million. And we have a lot of money sitting in China and RMB right now in our Skyland entity, and we could probably apply to move it. But because we're doing so much with the government, we don't want them to think, oh, we're just trying to move our money out. But I think it's a very, it's hard. It's an issue. It's a very big issue, particularly if you're making money in China. You can't assume you're going to actually get it out. So then you got to assume, okay, well, if I'm growing something in China and I can't get it out, what does that mean? So then you got to start thinking about, is it an asset that I can sell in China to another Chinese company that I could then get dollars with? But I think that the government's aware of it. I think there are a number of banks that are trying to find solutions. But look, ICBC's, like I said, 10% owned by Goldman Sachs. They have offices in LA and New York, and if they really wanted to figure it out today, I'm sure they could. Right now, they want to control the currency, and they are controlling it. And if someone doesn't have money in Singapore or Hong Kong or London, or if they're stuck in RMB and they sign a contract with you, you can't rely on the fact that you're getting dollars.
I agree with everything Ryan just said. I mean, that is that's a really important point. I mean, it was an issue when we were constructing our whole thing. I mean, it's why East West is going to have such a big business going forward, because you guys have crafted different ways to deal with that. We were lucky in that one of my best friends is a guy named Donald Tang, who was integral in the Hawaii deal, who was the vice chairman of Bear Stearns. He ran Asia for them, and had done a lot of complicated transactions, and was really helpful in as we moved forward, putting us in a place. But even with Honey, I mean, I think Honey's only done 2 deals outside of.
It's their second. You were their second deal outside of the U.S. or outside of China.
Yeah, there was us and Pizza Express for about $1.5 billion. So somehow they got about $1.6 billion out. But they, yeah, it's a real issue.
Right. Well, since we're reaching near the end of the panel, I want is one final thought, one final insight from each of you on what you think is coming next, just in terms of doing business with China. What's the one thing you're looking for that you think is either going to change or that you consider to be a positive goal that you're aiming for? Bob?
You know, it's interesting. Forbidden Kingdom was a really good movie, by the way.
Thank you.
And a true co-production. There haven't really been successful co-productions. I mean, real co-productions. Someone's going to crack that. Someone's going to crack a global story with universal themes that actually appeal to what's common with everybody, that maybe has some Chinese flavor or not. But right now there's kind of a weird thing that just doesn't feel like even the stuff that's being made right now actually he's gonna. So my thing is the big change will be when somebody figures out how to actually do that.
Stuart?
Bob sort of slightly preempted me there. I think the co-production conundrum is something that needs to be fixed right now. It's certainly a creative issue. There's a paucity of organic stories that have that capacity to be genuine co-productions, but also for the rules governing what can actually qualify as a co-production, and the timing as to when co-production status is actually endowed on a project it's way too fuzzy for prolific companies either in Hollywood or China to spend much time on. And so the reality is there's a lot of speculative co-production activity. There's not a whole lot really getting done, and I don't know whether it's through a shift in the creative dynamic or more likely a shift in the bureaucratic dynamic, but that has to change. And I think when it does, the floodgates may open to a lot more interactivity between the two industries.
Brian?
Just to that point, so we've actually agreed that we think it's more of a creative issue. And so what we've done as a company, and we intend to do more of in the future, is to ensure that our top creative people, both creative story people and physical production people, are consistently meeting with and sharing information with the leading Chinese film companies. And we've already started that process where we'll send our head of production over there to spend a week with each different company and vice versa. That's happening, and as that sort of creative exchange grows, I think whether it's a true co-production or not, forget whether it fits that co-production box. We believe we'll be able to create stories that could be primarily for China and then have worldwide appeal, or in the other direction. So that's where our best thinking is on that. In terms of areas of growth and what it's evolving so quickly. I hate to put any real prognostication on it. From a Lionsgate-centric point of view, we'd like to see some location-based entertainment initiatives grow in China, and from a larger market point of view, the video consumption, digital video consumption, whether on a PC or on a phone, right, is accelerating. Apple's now in the market, or will be in the market in a real way. So, over time. So, that's going to be super interesting to see that evolve.
Right. And Brian,
am I allowed to say 3 things? I know.
You can say 3 things. Can you be concise? That's the question.
The first thing that I want to say is that I heard Dominique speak at the ADL. It was earlier this year, right? December, and it was probably the most humble, greatest speech that I've ever heard of someone accepting an award. So completely unrelated to this, if I don't get a chance to say hi to you, I was amazed.
All right.
So
now Dominic's speaking tomorrow afternoon, so we'll just have that. So.
He's a great speaker. So I don't know what he's speaking about, but if any of you get a chance, he's incredible with his words. So The reason I wanted to say two things is that I've heard this common theme about content in China, and I don't agree that that's necessarily the going forward problem, because I think we've been working on a solution for really just how do you bring China and the U.S. together. So as most people, maybe many people here may not know, but there's a group, SARFT is the group that oversees everything.
Right.
And then underneath that you have something called Chinese Film Import and Export, which is the group that actually oversees all of the co-productions, whether you want to call it 30 or 68 or 67, depending on who's counting, and and also the flat fees. And then underneath that, they had two groups, which was Huasha and China Film Group, and then they just added us, so now there's three: Skyland, Huasha, and China Film Group. That's responsible for importing movies. What people don't realize is sitting right next to that, there's another group called the Chinese Film Production International, or Promotion International, and that's actually the group that's responsible for exporting movies. That's the group that works with all the local producers, all the local companies, does a lot of their own, and looks at how do we get our movies, distributed globally. And they've had a lot of people lie to them. They've had a lot of Americans lie to them. They've had a lot of Americans come in and say, because they're all so close, oh, well, we'll make sure your film gets distributed. Just help us make our film, or just give us a little money. And so this last July, Relativity announced a partnership exclusive partnership with the CFPI, who Mr. Gu, who used to run Huasha, now runs, where what we're actually doing is working on not just making co-productions, which we have in production now, because we've done them, but actually helping the two markets come together. And one of the things we said to them was, well, you've been lied to, and we've been honest with them, because Chinese culture, the rest of the world doesn't understand. I don't care if you have 1.5 billion people and $50 trillion, you're still not going to get Americans to watch movies that have culture in it that they don't get. So what we have to do is really come up with a formula that's global, where it works in the Chinese world, and it works in the American world, and it works cross country.
And that's the key.
That's the key. So we did work together. We signed this pact, and we're now working very closely together to come up with storylines that are Chinese based, things like The Long March or The Merchant of Shanghai, that are stories that will resonate if we make them correctly with the world. So the last point, that was what I was going to say, is I think that's going to change and not be the impediment. The impediment right now is that 92% of the revenue comes from the box office, not unlike the U.S. was in whatever 1940. And the impediment is that you live or die by your box office receipt. So right now you got 2 weeks, movie comes out, you make your money or you don't make your money. And when you start looking at the windowing, whether it's free TV or pay TV or the deals that Lionsgate's making with digital, that's all still regulated by propaganda and SARFT. So people open up a digital channel and they start showing content, and there's a red notice on their door that says shut it down because we don't like the content, and we're supposed to monitor it. And it's about the government finding a way that they can feel comfortable monitoring something that isn't physical going through them, and yet allowing the channels to open up. And that's the way, the Chinese box office may exceed our box office next year or the year after, but the film industry is going to be nowhere near the size because our box office is 20%. And I think that's where the impediment is, and that's where the Chinese government really needs to figure out, how do we allow these digital channels to open? Because everybody's talking about pay channels and streaming channels, and there's every time I go there, I get 100 pitches of, I got the way to do this streaming channel, and I got the hotels, and I can get this. But I'm telling you, every one of them, the next time I show up, they're shut down.
Yep.
And
so
that's it.
That's it. And that's what we're looking for. So thank you, everybody, very much. And thank you for staying, and we really appreciate it.